Hi there. I need to give a quick introduction to this full hour of footage that I recorded from New York Comic Con's Spotlight on the Career of George R. R. Martin panel. Because originally I didn't think I'd be posting this. I thought, a major news site would have recorded the whole thing and posted it through professional channels. A week later, I haven't seen anything. So I'm cobbling together what I have, just with a handheld iPhone. I didn't have a tripod or anything, just set up and click play. And the issue with that is, at the earlier Dunkin' Egg launch panel, they said, please don't use your iPhones that much because they were, showing footage with the trailer. I was half worried they'd confiscate it, but the bigger issue was I was worried that I'd run out of battery. What if I was recording for 30 minutes and then it ran out of battery and then I lost the entire file because, it doesn't save? So more worried about battery life. My plan was to record multiple clips back to back to know that I got something in the bag, that I'd be recording for 10 minutes, stop, then start again. So I managed to cover most of the panel, about 6 or 7 clips, and I just put them together back to back. The other issue is, I've never seen George R. R. Martin live before, and I wanted to enjoy seeing him with my own eyes. I didn't have a tripod set up, so there were points where I wasn't recording for a stretch of 5 to 10 minutes, but then if something really important came on again, I'd go, oh, I need to start recording again. Ultimately, I did manage to get 60 minutes of footage out of what was a full 90-minute panel. I don't mean it ran overtime. It was this guest of honor panel. It was a special hour-and-a-half panel. And I don't just mean the first 60 minutes. I mean, there's gaps in it that you can tell where I skipped something, but no one else, to my knowledge, has posted a recording of this. So it's clips back-to-back by topic that before they move on to something else. So there's an uninterrupted, 15-minute clip of him going, this was my comic book career in the 1980s, things like that. So mostly this was for battery life, that I didn't want to continuously record it at first, because I thought, what if I get 50 minutes in, I run out of battery, then I lose the whole thing? The issue with this, of course, is the one time I directly interacted with Martin at the panel about 20 minutes into it, I wasn't recording, so I lost that, but I'll interject in this one more time to explain what happened. Otherwise, I'm just putting the clips back to back in here. So, here we are. Enjoy.
R. R. Martin is the Hugo Award-winning, Nebula Award-winning, Locus World Fantasy, British Fantasy Award, and Balrog Award-winning, internationally best-selling and globally renowned author of the Song of Ice and Fire series, Fever Dream, The Armageddon Rag, and many other novels, and creator and editor of the Wild series. Some of his work has been adapted to television. I've heard it's done all right. Television is where he started out, working on shows like Beauty and the Beast and The Twilight Zone. He was also involved in the creation of the Elden Ring computer game. And most importantly, he has been kind enough to join us in conversation today.
Those awards that you mentioned, very traumatic history with some of them. My Balrog Award, I never received it. They claimed that they were driving it to the post office, and they were rear-ended, and all the Balrogs for that year was destroyed. And I said, well, you were going to make a replacement? And the Balrog guy said, no, I'm moving to your mom. You'll never hear from me again. And I did. And that's the end of that.
It was one of of them, is it the nebula or the Hugo that looks like a dildo? I'm sorry.
No, it's the British Fantasy Award that looks like it. Pluto looks like, well, I suppose you could say so.
It's a rocket ship, right? So
It's a rocket ship.
This is exactly the
A
conversation.
silver rocket ships, and the nebulous is a big clump of lucite, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
George, I think on the whole, it's best to begin with the question. I'm sure most people won't answer. It's the question that's on so many minds, and I'm hoping, yes, I know everyone is hoping, you can tell us, can the Giants keep winning?
Whoa! Yeah!
Sooner or later, Dart has got to go.
It all depends on whether Jackson Dart is a real thing. I don't know, but so far so good.
I mean,
We've had
just
other-
kids.
You know, I liked a couple years ago when they had the third stringer came off the bench, and he was like a Jersey kid who lived with his mother. He lived with his mother, and nobody even thought he'd make the team, and he led them to three wins in a row. And I thought for a minute, that's it. That's it. This is the perfect story. If I was writing this for a show, and the kid who didn't even make the team and lived at home, except it faded, and now he's on some other team.
I know you guys don't want us to talk about the Giants.
I'm weird because, you know, I'm, as you can see, I'm very, very old. Really old, anybody here. And I grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey. And that's like right across that water that you have there. So the sports, when I was a kid, my father loved sports, and I was a Dodger fan. Brooklyn Dodger fan. Brooklyn Dodger fan. It had to be in New York in those days. There were three teams, and you rooted for one, and you hated the other team. I didn't like those Yankees or Giants or something. I was a Dodger fan. And I was around long enough to 1955, Dodgers finally won, Brooklyn Dodgers won the World Series. And it seemed like the world would be good, but then they went to Los Angeles, and we got the Mets. So I've had the Mets. But then I also had the Giants, the football Giants, the New York football Giants. Rooted for them, but then they started this new league at the AFL, and he had a team called the Titans, who didn't keep to that name long. They became the Jets. I thought, well, that's it. I need a team to root for in this league, too, because the Giants are losing all the time. These Jets seem pretty good, so I became a Jets fan and a Giants fan, which I gather is forbidden by New York. But I don't care. I do it anyway, and of course, the Giants were terrible for that whole period there, but the Jets got this kid, Joe Namath, who was pretty good, and then the Super Bowl started, and Joe, as I said, not everybody knows this, but some people know this. Joe Namath, on Super Bowl III, went down to the crossroads and met the devil, and made a plan with him to win Super Bowl III on the condition that the Jets would never, ever.
It's funny because it's true.
People are speculating, that am I going to die soon? I have said I'm not going to die until I see the Jets and the Giants in the Subway Super Bowl. Trying to phrase this in a way that's not obscene. George R. Martin blasts cocaine, George R. Martin attacks cocaine, George R. Martin, destroys toy. Bones Tolkien. Tolkien is the most influential writer in my life. I had a lot of writers who influenced me, and I read when I was younger, and but no matter how much you love a writer, you don't want to just duplicate him. That's not creative at all. You want to bring your own stuff to it and your own thoughts. As much as I love Tolkien, I do they have things here. So when I say, Gandalf should have stayed dead, that's not an attack on Tolkien. That's a discussion of a literary choice. And if J.R. was here on the panel, we could debate it or have a discussion. I'm sure we would. But no, I love Tolkien, and I love many of the other fantasies. Although modern fantasy, as it exists today, is really so Tolkien influenced. Not that he invented fantasy. Fantasy goes back to centuries, millennia, Gilgamesh and the Greeks and the Romans and all this stuff.
Green Knight.
Green Knight. And in the centuries after that, there were people like Spencer, and there were other people writing fantasies of various types. But Tolkien transformed the genre, and everything since Tolkien has been influenced by him in one way or another, either following his lead or in some cases rejecting his lead and saying, no, I'm going to do it differently. And there are some fantasy writers who have been very, let me say, not fans of Tolkien. Michael Moorcock being perhaps
Right.
prominent example of that. So Tolkien is huge, but I like a lot of the other fantasy too. I mean, even before I discovered Tolkien, I was reading occasional sword and sorcery, as it was called back then, dominated by the ghost of Robert E. Howard and Conan the Barbarian. And those were a lot of fun, especially if you were like a 12-year-old boy, like I was, and they were scantily clad women and trying to speak
Covers. Presented covers.
the French presented covers, yes, on the Lancer editions. Howard's works have been out of print for decades, but Lancer came back and published those beautiful editions with their Frazetta covers, and I love those. And there were other people in that tradition, in the sword and sorcery tradition. I loved Fritz Leiber, Crawford and Marie Mouser.
Yeah.
They were fabulous too. And Jirella Jory, the sword and sorcery, leading female sword and sorcery practitioner. Jirella Jory by Seal Moore, I think that was Seal Moore.
There was Lee Brackett who did all the great, because he was more science fiction.
Lee Brackett did, a lot of stuff on Mars and Venus and stuff like that.
I mean, I always thought that the Game of Thrones books, you were just saying, there are decisions Tolkien made you question, but you love the work. And I always thought that Game of Thrones was very much in conversation with those earlier works, with Lord of the Rings, and also there's all the stuff about, I'm embarrassed to say I'm blanking on his name, the character Jason Momoa played in the first season who gets wiped out from gangrene spoilers. But
Jason also played Conan,
well, that's why they cast him as Conan, because of the role he played in Game of Thrones.
Right. And he's amazing. Jason has taken over the world now. I don't know if any of you have noticed. And that part of the world that Pedro Pascal has not taken over. So, having these roles in Game of Thrones worked out pretty well.
But so who are the other writers that you think, it was Tolkien, it was Robert E. Howard, who else you sort of, because I feel so much of Game of Thrones is sort of circling back to inspect those earlier fantasies and say, well, maybe it would have been more like this, given the way people are, given the way what we know about history.
A lot of people will talk about, someone who's known as a fantasist, as I seem to have become now, being influenced by previous fantasy writers, and most notably Tolkien or Howard or something. But in my case, there's a lot of other influences. First of all, this is the New York City Comic-Con, by the way. There was a time that it was about comic books. And I was a big comic book fan when I was, in junior high and early high school. I was writing for the early comic fanzines. And I came to the first New York City Comic-Con, 1964. One afternoon in Greenwich Village.
Who were the guests?
Well, the guests, that was interesting. Believe it or not, they couldn't get any of the really well-known writers and editors to come to that thing. We had a few guests who were artists who from the Golden Age, who I didn't really know, because by then we were well into the Silver Age. But Stan Lee, he didn't come himself, but he sent his secretary. Fabulous Flo Steinberg, who was always talking about how great Fabulous Flo was, and she showed up and talked to us for a while. But the one who really blew my mind anyway, was Steve Ditko. Steve Ditko. How many of you are actually comic book fans, or if you're just like Game of Thrones fans? Steve Ditko, Stan Lee was the editor and writer who created most of the Marvel characters we know today. And he had a whole bullpen of artists. The two most prominent being Jack Kirby and this guy Steve Ditko, who did the art for Spider-Man, and a little later Doctor Strange, and of course other things and all that. But I met Ditko at the convention. I had a conversation with him and said, you know, I love your art for Spider-Man and Doctor Strange especially. I love Doctor Strange. I love Spider-Man, but Doctor Strange is my favorite. Like, yeah, he's my favorite too. So that was cool, and he autographed a manila envelope. And then he left and never came to another comic book convention. The rest of his life, so I must have scared him.
My Steve Ditko story is the editor of my comic book, Chris Lyle. Chris was like the best man at my wedding, a wonderful guy, and he loves comic books, and he found Steve Ditko's address in Brooklyn or something, and sent him a letter, because there was no other way to get in touch with him, and said, I'd love to do an artist edition of your early work. And he waited months to hear something back, and eventually he got a letter from Steve Ditko, and he opened it with trembling hands, and in it was a sheet of paper with one sentence scrawled on it, never contact me again. Yeah, so it was a little bit nicer when you did. Did I hear somewhere that you actually own a copy of the first appearance of Spider-Man? Is that true, or am I out of my mind there?
Excuse me?
Do you own a copy of the first issue that Spider-Man appeared in, or did I hear? I know you own the first issue that the Fantastic Four appeared in, don't you?
Yes, I have both. Spider-Man's first appearance was Amazing Fantasy number 15, which was, Marvel was trying, it was just the beginning of what would later be the Marvel Age. And Marvel, for years, hadn't published any superheroes, so they actually, if you trace the history of the company, you go back to the Golden Age, and they were a company called Timely, and they had their own heroes, but all of the superheroes kind of died in the late 40s, early 50s, and then you got the era of the crime comics and the horror comics. Yeah. The only ones who survived continuously from the Golden Age to Silver Age were the major DC heroes, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Not even like what I would think was the second tier, the Flash, Green Lantern, Hawkman. They all went under too. Superman and Batman were gigantic, and Wonder Woman was not as gigantic as the others, but she survived continuously because her creator put in a clause in his contract that said, if you ever stop publishing Wonder Woman, I get all the rights back. Well, they went, wow, that Siegel and Schuster had put that in. They have a whole different future, but now Siegel and Schuster lost Superman, and but then Julie Schwartz started the Silver Age and brought back a different Flash, a different Green Lantern.
He was the famous editor for DC Comics.
Right.
The most important thing to know about Julie Schwartz is he figured out that if you stick a monkey on the cover, it will increase sales by 50%. But only for one issue. So if the issue following has a monkey on the cover, sales will drop back down. It's very big monkey on the cover.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, huge winner.
I'm learning something about it.
You've had a lot of stuff adapted to comic books, but have you ever written for them?
I need to interject here again. Like I said in the introduction, though thankfully this is the only time in this whole thing I'm going to interject, because this is the one point in my entire life that I've ever directly interacted with George R. R. Martin in person, and I wasn't recording it. That they were going through his career chronologically and got up to how by 1980 he shifted to working in comic books. But as he explained, while he's good at coming up with story ideas, he's not very skilled at the actual drawing part of comics, which really isn't that unusual. I mean, it's a common practice in the industry to have a penciler distinct from the story writer. Alan Moore wasn't the lead artist on his 1980s run for Swamp Thing, then Watchmen, V for Vendetta. Stan Lee was a story editor. I mean, these men could draw, but, a lot of Stan Lee's stuff was actually done by Steve Ditko, so, division of labor and everything. But anyway, Martin explained in the early 1980s, I shifted from sci-fi short stories like the Thousand Worlds universe I made to working in comic books, but I'm a story ideas guy. I'm not really a professional drawer. So I ended up doing a lot of text stories. That's the term he used, text stories. And then Martin turned to the audience and asked, "Do you guys know what text stories are?" And he paused as if waiting for a response, and I tentatively interjected back at him, "Wildcards?" And I wasn't being sarcastic. I thought he meant that as a segue to talking about how he shifted to working on Wildcards, which is kind of like X-Men, but written as a book. It's an anthology of short stories by different writers, but it's text. Because by the 1980s is when he started working on Wildcards. So just the way the panel flowed, I thought that's what he meant. And I normally would never randomly shout an interjection into a panel. I mean, the way he said it sounded like he was genuinely asking the audience a question. He turned to look at the audience, asked, "Do you guys know what text stories are?" and paused in such a way that it seemed he was expecting us to spontaneously respond. Also, I didn't really have to shout, because it's not like I was in the way back of the big 300-person panel room. No, I managed to get in 5 rows from the front center aisle. So I was like maybe 20 feet away from Martin, so I had to speak up, but I wasn't like shouting an interjection. I was close enough I could just pipe up, "You mean Wildcards?" But as this played out, the way the exchange went was Martin asked, "Do you guys know what text stories are?" Long pause, and I tentatively said, "Wildcards?" But then Martin quickly responded, looking at me, "No, Wildcards is prose. I mean text stories for comics." Which confused the entire room for a second, because this is something they haven't done in like 40 years. But Martin explained it was actually really interesting that it turns out that back in the day, talking height of the Bronze Age, 1980s, to get a mailing permit, a Class 2 mailing permit for comics, they legally needed to meet a minimum required amount of text material in every comic. So, the back matter where I'm used to seeing like them answering letters to the editor or something. But back in the day, 80s, that time period, they would have short stories set in the Marvel Universe or DC that we're talking 1 or 2 pages of text story. So apparently the distinction is, like, there is a legal distinction between a novella and a short story as an official term. Like in a sci-fi anthology, a short story is like 12 pages or something. No, that's why he calls it just a text story, because it's literally 1 or 2 pages of just filling in back matter of something set in that comic book. And it doesn't have to be great. It's to meet the legal requirement to mail it out, so it's easy money. So the whole room was going, ooh and ah, and actually that's really intriguing, because we didn't know they used to do that. Of what did he mean by text stories? So he worked on that for a bit, and then he advanced to working on all those other things. So thankfully I wasn't embarrassed about this, because then the moderator said, we're up to discussing the 1980s in your career, and actually that was a good question, because the next one, he was reading off a list, he said, the next question on my list here actually is specifically about wild cards. So the question that just came from the audience was actually a good segue setting up what I was about to talk about. So it's not like this came out of nowhere. That the moderator then said, yeah, we were about to talk about wild cards, so just getting ahead of us. And I think Martin actually said, I'm getting to wild cards, but more on that in a minute. So this is the one time in my life I've ever directly verbally interacted with the guy. Now, as proof that this really happened, and I'm not making it up, if you look in this video, in the front row on the right side, you can see Aziz and Ashaya from History of Westeros podcast, who also have a big YouTube channel. You can see her bright hair there, the red hair. They're a bigger channel by a long shot, so they got a full press pass. I just got a content creator thing where they give you a pass for the day. Press pass means you literally get to sit first row, like they said they were with Martin's family and stuff. So they were first row, and they were making an audio recording of it. And I asked, because I knew they were there, I asked, do you have recordings of this? And they're on Blue Sky, not Twitter. And to independently confirm this really happened, that's why I've just been showing this screenshot of our exchange where they said, were you that guy that tentatively responded wild cards? So this is proof enough that this really happened. They responded. Privately, they did send me a nice 2-minute audio clip of this exchange, so I have it, but in private, because they made me promise not to post it publicly, because they said when the heavier restrictions on a press pass, that might screw things up for us, because we are not going to share the hour-long 90-minute audio recording we made of this. It's just for private research. I understand that completely. I said, it's not about posting it publicly. I mean, I have the rest of the thing. It's more about, I want to be able to tell the grandkids that I actually interacted face-to-face with Martin, and that I'm not making this up, That when I'm an old man, I want to be able to tell people at cons, oh yeah, this is the one time I ever actually directly interact with Martin. And the direct comparison I used was, wouldn't you really like, if you were like, a teenager in the early 1970s, to have like a 1-minute recording from a radio show or something where you personally interacted with J.R.R. Tolkien? Like when he was still alive, from like the 60s or something. And there are a few video clips of him that he recorded over time, but just, it wasn't even a big exchange. It's just I went, yeah, like 40 years from now, I want to be able to say, if this is, hopefully I'll be able to run into Martin at other cons. But I don't know if he's ever coming back to the East Coast for a big, this is for the big launch of Dunkin' Eggs. So this is the one time that this actually happened, and I just wanted some private recording of it. And I think the screenshot is proof enough that my story is real, that they went, oh yeah, you were the guy that answered wild cards. So this is just a funny exchange. It was actually interesting to explain, oh, we used to put text stories for a page or two in the back to meet the legal mailing requirement. That when people go, oh, Martin has these boring stories. No, he is not rambling. He is telling these really interesting stories of, I think it depends on if you even know who Steve Ditko was anymore. When people go, oh, Martin was rambling about these nobodies, like how he met Michael Moorcock and Steve Ditko. And do you understand that these are major writers? Like Roger Zelazny and Jack Vance, that it is interesting. He has an interesting life. He met all of these major literary figures. And if you're into that, they're really exciting stories about how he literally went to the first Comic-Con and met Steve Ditko the one time he went to a Comic-Con. These are interesting stories if you're into this topic beyond just, oh, I'm just watching the TV show. So, no, the audience is wrapped on just, he's had a very interesting life. He saw the rise of the industry because he's been in it since the 70s. And then he worked in TV and he knows a lot of stuff. So, this is the one time I've ever directly interacted with him. I mean, I've interacted with him over the internet before, back when his blog was open for comments and stuff like a decade ago. He has answered like half a dozen questions I posted over time on like lore things. as he has with 100 other people, because he really interacted on his blog a lot until people started yelling at him all the time. So, ultimately, I can say that, at least up to now, the one time in my life I've ever directly interacted with Martin, I used on a wildcards question. So this is the one other time I'm going to interject in here just because I ended up not recording it, and now here's all the other clips of the panel.
The internet spoke back. No, it's okay. No, it's okay. Someone said, thank him for Wild Cards, my favorite series of all time. And while I don't need an adaptation, is there progress on the show that was announced? And I do recall there was some discussion for a while of the Wild Card show. Is that still happening?
Well, maybe eventually, but not today. Wild Cards actually is an older series for me than A Song of Ice and Fire. We started, the first Wild Card book came out in 1987, and I think we've had 34 of them by now. To be clear, I've written for some of it. My main function in Wild Card has been as the creator and the editor. And it's superheroes in prose. It's not really superheroes, it's maybe superpowers in prose, done more realistically and gritty, as you said. There was something in the water then in the mid-late 80s. You had Dark Knight, Watchmen by Alan Moore, Wild Cards. They're all variations on the same thing. Like, we've grown up, we'd read all these superhero stories, and but we could see that we wanted to do something a little more realistic. But we took different paths to it, which is why it's interesting.
I mean, certainly the whole Batman thing about losing your parents at a young age, and so then, as an adult, you go out at night dressed in rubber to be beaten up by strange men in the house, by enemies, is an odd an odd hobby.
It is a little strange.
You said
when I started really collecting comic books and getting into it in the 50s, Batman was not as big as he later became. I mean, he was an old DC hero, but the 50s version of Batman, if you read him, is sort of silly. I mean, he's
like a square 50s guy.
He's showing up in Gotham City is full of giant typewriters and other weird architectural things.
Yeah.
He's always fighting a villain on the keys of a giant typewriter and punching him, and there's no darkness in it whatsoever. The original Batman was a very dark character, as originally created, and he became, again, the Dark Knight, but in between there was the silly Batman period, in which you had the stupid TV show. And I love the TV show. One of that best?
Yeah, he goes surfing with the Joker. A shark comes up the bite of your glass of a shark upon his stuff. I mean, some people were like, oh, Christian Bale's my Batman. Adam West is my Batman.
Holy moly! That's actually Captain Marvel.
I've also always wondered where he got the giant penny. You ever notice when we're in the Batcave?
Oh yes, there's always that giant stupid penny in the back. Was there a story about that? I don't know.
There must be, right? There has to be something. There is. Someone says there is.
I did like the Batcave. I mean, if I was a superhero, I would want to have a cave. Full of giant souvenirs from all of my
your victories.
That's right, yes. Of course, I read comics when I was a little kid, not only Superman and Batman and the other superhero comics, but back in the 50s, the comics there was a lot more different genres. There were of course, romance comics for the girls. There were the funny animal comics, Foghorn Leghorn or Sugar and Spice or whatever they were, and you read those when you were a little kid, and you got rid of them. There were hot rod comics. Now, I lived we never owned a car. Never, ever. We lived in the projects, we owned no car. I took buses or walked everywhere. But that always made me want a car. So I remember reading hot rod comics, which were always about teenage kids getting some piece of crap car and fixing it up really cool, and then they're winning all the races, and the kids were in that genre. And there were westerns and all of these other types of things. And I read those for a long time, but at a certain point, it was Christmas, and a friend of my mother's, an old childhood friend, for Christmas gave me a hardcover book, Have Spacesuit Will Travel by Robert A. Heinlein. And I read the book. And then I started reading books. I started buying books, which meant I had less money to buy comics. So I had to cut down on comics. And I also got rid of some of my old early comics. I was stupid back then. Everybody else I didn't know these would be worth anything. But I got rid of all my comics. And like a year passed, but then I started seeing these wonderful comics. What the hell is this? There were these 4 people fighting this giant monster. And one of them looks like a monster himself. What's going on here? And I read the Fantastic Four, and then Spider-Man came along a little later, and then Stan Lee was just inventing these things I swear, no one, in such a short period of time, he invented the basic fundament of the Marvel Universe. Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, X-Men, Avengers, Thor, Captain America. Well, Captain America had been, he'd been frozen since World War II. But they brought him out and brought him back. And it's amazing, that whole lineup of things that Lee created in a relatively short period of time, more than 2 years. Yeah.
I want to turn back to Game of Thrones. It changed everything and changed your life forever. And then the series has continued. There's been spin-off series. HBO is now launching a 3rd spin-off series. It's called A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. It was first published as a novella. What was the title? When was the novella?
The Hedge Knight was the first novella. The Hedge Knight, and then there were 2 more, The Sworn Sword and The Mystery Knight, and we hope to adapt those 2. And the first one, Night of the Seven Kingdoms, is successful.
What can you tell us about Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and what's your level of involvement?
I had published a Game of Thrones, and I had a 3-book contract, and I was working on the 2nd volume in the series, which would eventually be published as A Clash of Kings. That was the first indication that there was difficulties ahead, because I had sold a trilogy that would consist of 3 books, A Game of Thrones, and what was the second? It was Game of Thrones, The Dance with Dragons, and anyway, there were 3. And of course, I blew the deadline, as I never want to do. And I had, a lot of fantasy books then. Fantasy has always been kind of large books. Tolkien said that thing too. And they were about 800 pages in manuscript, I think. And I'm writing Game of Thrones, and I just sail right past 800 pages, 900 pages, 1,000 pages. I'm not even close to the end. Oh, God, I can't finish this in time. And yes, I finished this character, this character, this character, but I haven't even started this character or that character. So at that point, I said, yeah, my trilogy will be 4 books.
What did Douglas Adams say about Hitchhikers? He said the increasingly misnamed Hitchhikers Galaxy trilogy. It was like the 6th book or something.
Yeah, Gene Wolfe, a genius fantasist who I was in some writers' workshops with when we both lived in Chicago, he had his trilogy that we were reading in the writers' workshop. It just became 4 volumes, and he didn't blink, and no one else blinked. I do it too. Anyway, so I rearranged my plans, and I moved some stuff that was going to be in Game of Thrones into A Clash of Kings, and I'm writing now A Clash of Kings, which wasn't part of the original deal. And and of course I'm running late on it, and as I had a want to do. And Robert Silverberg, I'm sure many of you know Robert Silverberg. He's one of the great science fiction writers, Grandmaster from SFWA. Been writing since the 50s. He was the youngest guy ever to win a Hugo. I think he won a Hugo for Best New Writer when he was 18 years old. Pretty damn impressive. But also a great editor. He had done the New Dimension series. He had edited for Science Fiction Writers America. He edited one of their Hall of Fame books. And he had sold an anthology idea. He had edited original anthologies before with the New Dimensions line. But this was going to be an epic fantasy thing, and he contacted 10 gigantic best-selling writers of epic fantasy. And they were all going to write original stories set in their particular universes. Because one of the things about epic fantasy is that world building is very essential. You know, you're not just writing a story. Tolkien created Middle-earth, and he wrote a number of stories set there, and other people have done it and created even more stories. So the 10 writers were invited. Silverberg got a very, very nice advance for that. I don't know how many of you know how publishing works, but an anthology, you sell a book, you get an advance, and you pay the writers from that, and what you don't give to the writers, you get to keep for yourself. And so Silverberg invited me to be in it. Now, that was, number one, I was very happy with that because I had an enormous amount of respect for Silverberg and the books he edited. He was a great editor. He never published third-rate material. It was good stuff. And so being included in this with these other people. But, I think I said a minute ago that he included in this 10 huge best-selling writers. Actually, he included 9 huge best-selling writers and me. And I was not unknown. I was not a kid off the street. I had won Hugos, I had won Nebulas, I had lost Hugos, I had lost Nebulas, and I published predominantly in the 70s. A few fantasy stories, but mostly science fiction stories, occasionally horror stories. There was this period where horror was very, very hot. It had to do with some guy from Maine. His books were like huge. Everybody else was trying to write his books. And picture a bookstore, and it was all paperbacks with black covers and dripping blood, literally. So I had one of those, but so I said, sure, I'd be glad to do an anthology. Now, I hadn't even finished the second book in the series. So now that I'm in this book and I have to deliver a novella for it to be in this book with the 9 very prominent writers, it was like, well, what the hell am I going to write about? It has to be a Westeros book, but it can't be a sequel because I haven't finished the main story yet. I can't write what's happening to Jon Snow or Tyrion or Dany or anybody after the series. I got several more books to write in the series. I don't want to give away, so it has to be a prequel. But that's fine because in my head I had a lot of stuff about Targaryen history, some half-formed, some pretty definitely formed. So I looked at all of the eras that I had sort of roughed out, and I picked the era that the opening stories were in, and I wanted to tell, if you're publishing stories, you're going to get reviews. Not so much in those days as it is now, when there's all these annoying people on the internet. But you would get reviews, and you'd read them, and or you wouldn't read them. I have a number of friends, other writers who say, I never, ever, ever read my reviews. I consider those liars. I had to believe that for a fucking minute, but things that one of the reviews had said about my book, generally positive reviews, that, look, here's another fantasy about kings and wizards and lords and knights and they're fighting for a throne. And it's pretty well done, but we don't need any more of these things, do we? Nobody ever writes about the small people, the small folk, as I call them, the peasants. And that's kind of true. Maybe I should do a story, this prequel, I should do a story about a guy who's not a lord or not a king, and he's not anyone's bastard son. He's just a guy growing up and wondering where his next meal is going to come from. And so somehow the characters of Duncan came to me, and I started writing the story that became the hedge knight, which is a term I'd used before, for a knight who was just, who always had wizards and had doctors in your medieval history, and hedge knight was just a step in that. What happened though is I'm writing this story, and as I always do, I'm struggling with it, and I'm late. And Silverberg has a deadline at the end of the year, and we're in like September or something, and he sends me an email saying, "I hear that you're way behind on your book. You couldn't fit the whole one in, and you had to do another book, and now you're late on that one. I can't. This anthology got a really big advance, and the publisher is very serious about wanting it in by the last day of the year. I cannot be late, because then they'll take some money away or something like that. So I'm going to have to drop you from the series, because I hear you're running late." And that was very traumatic. So, but instead of just weakly saying, "Oh, okay, I'm sorry," I look at my contract, which we'd already signed. Wait a minute. You can drop me from the book if I'm late, but I'm not late yet. So you can't drop me from the book. Or if you did, you'd have to pay me all this money. So I insisted that I remain in the book, and I continued to write the hedge knight. Silverberg had actually already replaced me. I don't know with who, but that's why if you look at Legends 1, which was the book that finally came out, it has 11 stories in it. There was some guy who came off the bench and wrote it. But I got in the hedge knight. I finished it like barely in time. That week between Christmas and New Year's, I was going fucking crazy. But I got the story to him on the last day of the year, barely meeting the deadline. The interesting thing about that is like 2-3 other writers also got their stories done on the last day. So I may have been the one that they were worried about, but I wasn't the only one who was doing that. But Legends 1, or just Legends, was, I think, an amazing book, and not only did it have hedge knight in it, but it had an original Robert Jordan story. It had an original Anne McCaffrey story about dragons. It had original stories by a number of the great great fantasy writers of the age, all set in their established university, and it had a couple stories by this Stephen King guy. He got into that book, but
Yeah, I've read all his books, and I've always wondered what happened to him. They're going so well, so it's promising future.
I know. So it was quite. Anne McCaffrey was. Did any of you read any? Annie was a very talented writer. She was the first woman to win a Hugo for fiction, and I think a Nebula too. She sold her dragon books to John W. Campbell initially.
And in a way, she set the stage for Iron Flame and all the dragon books that sort of, that have been so successful in just the last couple of years.
And Annie's books sold very, very well. She was a best-selling writer, but she moved to Dublin, I think, and lived the rest of her life there. She always was trying to get the rest of us to move on Ireland. We were tempted.
Why didn't we listen to her?
Ireland had no income tax on writers. Whoa! Why did we all move there?
They also created the universal basic income for artists.
But Anne's first dragon story was Weird Search, which John Tobin Campbell published in Astounding. And that's a science fiction magazine. So, and her dragons, they're dragons, but they're telepathically connected with their riders, and they live on another planet, far, far distant planet in another corner of the galaxy. So Anne would always say for years, I don't write fantasy, I write science fiction. I'm a science fiction writer. These are science fiction stories. Until Silverberg sold that Legends anthology, and it was paying such a big advance. And I said, yeah, here's a fantasy story.
Knowing what we know about physics.
Right. Yeah, a lot of these legends, these old stories don't hold up since, and I had enough of a science fiction sensibility that I tried in someone like Fever Dream to justify that.
So is Game of Thrones secretly science fiction?
It's secretly a little historical fiction. That was the other thing that I was heavily influenced by, not only Stan Lee and the comic books and Tolkien and fantasy, but the historical fiction of the day. I read Ivanhoe, and I read the works of Thomas B. Chastain, a very big best-selling historical fiction writer of the 50s, and Nigel Tranter, the amazing Scottish historical fiction writer who just died, I'm about to say a few years ago, it was probably a decade or not, but he kept writing books right into his 90s. Well into his 90s, he was turning out another Scottish historical fiction things, all of which, if you know Scottish history, it's really depressing. And all the stories seem to start the same way. The king was a small boy, and the lords were quarreling. And yeah, it was pretty cool. Maurice Druon, also The Accursed Kings, the amazing French series of historical fiction. And I like the grittiness of historical fiction. So I said, well, let me see if I can combine some of Tolkien's things with some of the real grittiness and hard edge of the best historical fiction.
We're starting to run out of time, so we're going to move slightly into a speed round.
Oh my God.
But maybe the last pre-speed round question. This is another one from the internet, and I actually thought it was a really sort of touching question. This person asked if you've ever felt like a failure or ever has imposter syndrome. And you've been so successful, that's sort of a weird thought. But then I think,
no, not at all. Not at all. No, I sometimes I'm called to speak to a writers' conference or a group of young writers. How many of you here are aspiring writers?
yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, a few, not too many.
You're doing it.
I feel very sorry for them. I tell them, this is not a profession if you are someone who needs security. If you need, financial security and would like to own a house and a car and things like that, and occasionally eat, there are other professions. You can be a real estate broker, or an insurance agent, or a fireman. I mean, there are lots of things, but writing fiction is not only a gamble, but it's a heated gamble. Now, my career has crashed and burned twice. I started telling my stories in the early 70s, and I got recognized pretty quickly. It was nice, I was nominated for the Campbell Award for the Best New Writer the first year it was given. I lost, but I was nominated. That's pretty good. And then the next year, I was nominated one of my short stories for the Hugo Nebula, prestigious award. I lost both of those, but still, it was pretty cool. So I was one of a group of the hot young writers who broke in the late 60s, early 70s. And for a long time, I just wrote short stories because novels were too intimidating for me. They were long. But I finally, after selling my first story in 71, around 76, I started writing my first novel. I will point out, by the way, because, you know, I know there's all this controversy and stuff about Vincent Winter and how late it is, but I've always had trouble with deadlines. And I don't feel happy breaching contracts or missing a deadline or anything like that. So all the other young writers of my class, my generation, the way you did it in those days is you wrote chapters, usually 2 or 3 chapters, and an outline for the rest of the book. And then you sent it around to the publishers, and somebody bought it, and then you had a deadline. You had to finish and deliver the entire book or such a thing. And I said, I hate doing outlines, and I'm not great with deadlines. So I just wrote my first novel, which was Dying Light. I wrote that. Nobody knew I was writing it. I was locked up, you know, just as I produced short stories. And then one day I called up my agent, Kirby McCauley, who was the same agent I shared with.
My dad's agent for many years.
And I said, look, I wrote a novel. Here, go sell it. And he did. He did. And not only did he sell it, he was an amazing, innovative agent. He came out of Minnesota, and he came to New York City, and he made up the new rule. He didn't like some of the rules of how an agent was supposed to function. He did things his own way, and it's amazing work. But I sold Dying Light for what was a lot more money than I thought I could possibly get, like 3 years before, because there'd been a movie called Star Wars. And suddenly science fiction was hot, and they were giving money to new writers who hadn't even had a book before. And then Lisa Tuttle and I wrote Windhaven a few years later, and it got even more acclaim and money. And then I wrote Fever Dream, which was my vampire steamboat novel. That was my, it had a black cover and driven. And that got even more, you know. And then I wrote a book called The Armageddon Rag. I was trying to do different things. I didn't want to just, you know, be one of the writers who wrote the same thing over and over again. So The Armageddon Rag was a rock and roll novel, part fantasy, part horror, part just a novel about the 60s and the 80s. And that sold for a 6-figure advance. First time I'd gotten that, and there was a lot of, this is it, George. This is your bestseller book. This book is going to be a huge bestseller, and you're going to become not just a science fiction writer, you're going to be a famous yada yada yada. Well, the problem with the Armageddon, I was nominated for the World Fantasy Book, lost. It was nominated for some other awards. It got some great reviews, and nobody bought it. So the thing about Hollywood, and it is to a certain extent it's true in books too, and it's true actually more now in whatever the hell year this is back then. But you're only as hot as your latest hotness. And suddenly I was not a hot young writer. I was someone they thought was a hot young writer, but now he was older and he had this book that was a giant flop. And I couldn't sell my next book. I had written all those other books kind of the same way I wrote Dying Light. I wrote the book, and then Kirby sold it. I wrote the book, Kirby sold it. Now I had actually started another book, and I said, oh fuck, I need money, and I'd done some stupid things with the money I got from Armageddon Rag. I'd like bought a house and a new car, and you know, I made the mistake of thinking, oh, look, it took me a year to write this book, and here's what I got for it. So I made that much money in a year. No. So I couldn't sell that book. So that was a pretty bad period here. At one point, I thought we were going to lose our house. And, you know, I was getting more credit cards. I had good credit, so I would get credit cards. But then the debt gets higher and higher. This is not good here. This is not good. But fortunately, same time, I got an invitation to work for television. A guy named Phil DeGare, who actually was a rock and roll guy who loved Armageddon Red. He had optioned it, well, great movie of it, movie never made. But then a few years later, Phil revived the Twilight Zone. He said, "You want to do a script?" And I said, "Yeah." I don't know how to do a script. I've never seen a script, but I have watched other script movies. I'll send you a box of scripts, and you can do it. So I did. I wound up writing 5 episodes of the Twilight Zone in the mid-'80s.
Did someone send you a sample script so you know what the format
Phil sent me a box of samples, and they were easy. Screenwriters don't like hearing it. You know, it's easier. It's easier. It is. What's not easier is the business. The writing is easier, but the business is, you know, you don't have one editor, you have 47. You're all giving you notes and things like that. So I worked for Twilight Zone for the remainder of the show, and then I did a little work for Max Headroom, and then I did 3 years on Beauty and the Beast with Linda Hamilton, Ron Perlman. So I had 5 years where I was writing, television largely, and at the end of that, you climb the ladder in television. In those days, you would usually start with a freelance script, not so much anymore. But then you get on staff, and when you start, your title is staff writer, usually. That's the lowest title, and you know that it's the lowest because it's the only one that has writer in it. And then when you get promoted, you're a story editor, executive story editor, co-producer, executive producer, or co-executive producer, supervisor, you climb the ladder. And at a certain point, you're high enough on the ladder that you move into development, which is where you're creating movies and pitching and writing your own shows. And I came out of Beauty and the Beast, and I was in development for 5 years. I did a number of feature film scripts that you've never seen, and I created a number of shows that you've never seen. And at the end of 5 years, I made a lot of money because they pay you very well in television. Every time you get one on promotions, you get more money. But I was tired of nothing actually being made. I said, "What? Yes, but I don't want to write for 4 guys in a room. And I want people to know these characters and these worlds and these stories. I do fall in love with them." So I went back to prose and I wrote that. But that was kind of my second failure. It's like, okay, my novel writing thing crashed with Armageddon Red, and then the TV film thing reached a certain level, but I couldn't seem to get beyond the level. I couldn't seem to get my own show on the air. Now, of course, the weird thing that's happening is people are buying all those old things that are and making movies and TV shows about them. And every time one of that happens and I announce it on my website, half the internet goes crazy. Why the fuck is Martin writing this other thing? What is he doing? And I want to say, I did it in 1993, guys. Come on. It was lying in my drawer and they wanted it, so I had a post a month or so ago about this where I just got, yes, I do love Winds of Winter. I haven't lost interest in it. I'm still working on it. But honestly, I love these other things too. I don't have any kids. I don't know, some of you probably have kids, right? Maybe you have more than one kid. Right? Johnny and Freddie and Susie and maybe some of them become cokeheads and most of them are. I still love them. I love Wild Cards and the characters I created for it, but the editing work I did as well. And some of the other writers that I got to work with, Roger Zelazny, who was like a mentor of mine, and people like Melinda Snodgrass and Vic Milan and Walter John Williams, John Miller. Today we had 40 different people who wrote for Wild Cards, created characters, and I got to, edit some of them and shape that universe. I like the universe. And, but there's the other universe. There's this whole world building thing. It's big. It's big, yeah. Are all of your stories in one universe? Or do you have many different universes?
Well, I guess they're all in the same universe except for I wrote a book called The Fireman where I ended the world. So that's a different universe. That'll be all over the characters. But
the Midwest where I lived at the time. The only person I really knew in Santa Fe was Roger's last name, fantastic writer. And Roger told me that there was a First Friday meeting that this guy, Tony Hillerman, mystery writer, had organized. And on the first Friday of every month, all the writers came to the Albuquerque Press Club, where we had a lunch together, and we sat around and talked. And, it was a lunch, but we would still be there at dinner time, usually, where writers can talk a lot. And I got to know Tony Hillerman, and I started reading some of his books, the Jolie Porn series, which was amazing. And Tony was a great guy. He had organized this thing. And we had, there were mystery writers there, and science fiction, fantasy writers, but there were also like romance writers, non-fiction writers, crime, thriller writers, every kind of writer in New Mexico was there. And talking about it, that was great. And Tony in particular was amazing. Have you read the Jolie Porn books? They're terrific books.
I love the series.
Tony wrote 4 Jolie Porn novels, and they were all successful, and they were getting more and more successful. They were bestsellers, And Jolie Porn is a Navajo policeman in the early 70s on the Navajo reservation, solving murders and all that. It was a fantastic world, fantastic character. And his agent sold the film rights, television film rights, which Tony was, of course, happy for. All those writers are happy when they give us a big check to do that. And then Tony sat down to write the 5th Jolie Porn book. And the studio said, no. We own Jolie Porn now. See, we paid you for him. We don't want anything else written about him. We own all of the Jolie Porn now. We own these 4 books. And needless to say, Tony was pretty fucking pissed off to discover that they were not just going to make movies of the existing books, but they thought they owned a character now. And they did own a character now. So the first thing he did was fire his agent. And then he said, well, what can I do now? They own Jolie Porn, but they don't own the Navajo. So he created a character called Jim Chi, who was a younger guy, also a cop on the Navajo reservation, and he wrote like 3 or 4 Jim Chi books, and those were also very successful. And then the studio never got the movie made, so the rights reverted to him, and now we had both of them. So there were like 4 Jolie Porn books, 4 Jim Chi books, and then with Lionsgate, both of them would get together, solve the case, and it was even more successful. Robert Redford was a big fan of Tony Hillerman's and his books, and he purchased rights after the original people had collapsed, and he produced a Jolie Porn feature film, which he hoped to release to theaters and start a whole, James Bond thing. But unfortunately, it didn't turn out as well as he had hoped. So he couldn't get a distributor. He couldn't get a theatrical release. They wanted to do it in one direct-to-video. And then he sold 3 more of Jolie Porn books to PBS, and it was made for television movies. So there were, those turned out better. Those had Wes Studi as Jolie Porn, and that was quite good news. But then that deal went away and it died here. So I heard it must have been, God, what year was it? It was maybe 2005 or something like that. I was contacted by Robert Redford's people, and also Chris Eyre, who had directed several of these things and was probably the leading Native American director in the country who had won the Sundance, gotten a Redford at the Sundance Film Festival with a thing called Smoke Signals. And they invited me to lunch, and when the Sundance kid invites you to lunch, you go to lunch. And I had an overall deal with HBO, and actually so did Redford. And he said, I hear you knew Tony. Tony had passed away. But we had the rights to this, but we'd like to get it going as a TV series. Can you have it in at HBO, can you help us sell this to HBO? So I sat down with Redford and Chris, and we interviewed a lot of potential screenwriters, and we put together a package for the show that would be Dark Winds, and then we went in and pitched it to HBO, and HBO bought it, and we continued to develop it and work it and then film it. But HBO did not pick it up the series to our disappointment. And I think what they thought was it was too similar to a True Detective, the series that they had. But they gave us the rights back, so then we had the rights back again. And Bob Redford, the Sundance kid, he had the Sundance Network. So we thought they might like it, and they did. So that's how it wound up on AMC, and we're now, we filmed 4 seasons, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and better. 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which was quite a thrill, and we have such an amazing cast of people. The actors, Son McLaren and Jessica and Kiowa, and it's a great show. And I'm glad I could do my little bit of opening doors and being part of it, reviewing some of the scripts and all that, but I'm not involved in that. I did, however, have my cameo just a few months ago. They said, let's put you and Bob in the jail cells and do a cameo with you. So I got to be in a scene with Robert Redford, so that's pretty cool. I gotta say, Redford was fucking amazing. It was an honor just to meet him and his wife Billy. I mean, you look at this film and say he was such a great actor, and he made it look effortless, but it wasn't effortless. And he did quite a range of things. He did thrillers, he did comedies, he did all sorts of stuff, and he founded the Sundance Film Festival, which is probably one of the best film festivals in that. And he was very instrumental in environmental stuff and all of these things that he did. And Bob left such an imprint on the world. He left the world a better place than he found it. Not only films and television, but everything.
I just want to thank you for letting me be a cameo in your Comic-Con experience. I want to thank you guys for showing up and